Fires tore across the Carthaginian fleet, sails burning, soldiers tumbling into the sea with no hope of rescue. In a single clash, the pride of Carthage, the master of the Mediterranean, was shattered. On paper, it should have been impossible. Carthage had ruled the seas for generations, while Rome was an army of farmers turned foot soldiers. They knew how to march, not sail. By all logic, the Romans should have drowned in humiliation. But instead, they found a weakness, built a plan around it, and flipped the balance of power at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. Welcome to Heroic History, your daily history channel, where we share the boldest moves and forgotten stories of ancient warfare. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss more epic moments like this one. So how on earth did Rome outfight Carthage, the kings of the sea, and turn one of history's greatest sea empires into a spectacle of humiliation? Let's dig in and see exactly what happened before the battle. The balance of power in the Mediterranean was pretty clear. Carthage, born from Phoenician maritime tradition, ruled the western Mediterranean seas for generations. Their navy was not just an adjunct force, it was central to their identity and security. As one historian puts it, the Carthaginians were more exercised in maritime affairs than any other people. They built fleets in series, maintained shipyards, and kept skilled crews of sailors and oarsmen on standby. During much of the Punic era, Carthage could field on the order of 300 to 350 warships, even after suffering losses in earlier conflicts. These weren't little boats either. Their standard warship was the quincare, literally 5, although the technical details are trickier than that. The quincare had 3 banks of oars. The upper 2 banks were each manned by 2 rowers per oar, the lowest by 1 rower, making up a total of about 300 men per ship, roughly 280 rowers plus 20 deck crew officers. In addition, each quinquereme normally carried about 40 marines, and in battle situations, that could spike to 120 marines per ship. So imagine when Carthage sails out with 300 ships, you're looking at nearly 90,000 rowers, plus perhaps 12,000 marines or more. And that's before you count officers, support crew, supply lines, repairs, etc. Carthage also had an advantage in seafaring culture. Many of their sailors were citizens, or at least intimately tied to their maritime economy, not just mercenaries. Their crews were highly practiced at maneuvers, handling ships in bad weather, coordinating sail and oar, pursuing enemy vessels, etc. In naval skirmishes before Rome got serious, Carthage dominated. They often outmaneuvered opponents, harassed supply lines, struck coastal raids, and maintained control over sea lanes. Their mastery was assumed until Rome challenged it. Why was the navy so important anyway? Well, this was all about Sicily. That island sat right in the middle of the Mediterranean, controlling key trade and supply routes. Whoever held Sicily could move troops and resources easily across the sea, and whoever didn't was at a huge disadvantage. Check the map if you want to picture it. Sicily right in the middle, Carthage down in North Africa, and Rome up on the Italian peninsula. Whoever controlled Sicily could control the Mediterranean, which made this battle a do-or-die moment for both sides. At the war's start, Rome was a land power through and through. The Roman Republic had little tradition or strength in large-scale naval warfare. They didn't have a big fleet, nor a deep bench of professional sailors. Jumping into a full-on naval war was a bold, even crazy move. In other words, if Rome wanted to win the First Punic War, they had to learn to fight on the water fast, so they had to scramble. In 260 BC, Rome made a bold move. It seized a decked Carthaginian warship or more than one, and used it as a model to build its own fleet. In just about 60 days, Rome constructed 100 quinqueres and 20 smaller vessels. That was extraordinary by ancient standards. A rapid industrial effort with shipyards, lumber, manpower, and coordination all exploding practically overnight. Yet, despite building ships, Rome lacked experienced crews. They didn't have the kind of seasoned mariners Carthage did. To make up for that, Roman commanders introduced the corvus, a boarding device, essentially a pivoting gangway with a spike to transform naval combat into something more like infantry combat at sea. The corvus allowed Roman marines to board enemy ships, turning the sea into a floating battlefield. The very idea was daring. Train legionnaires, land soldiers, to fight at sea. It meant Romans were less reliant on professional seamen for ship-to-ship fighting. The corvus neutralized some of Carthage's naval maneuver advantages. Rome's first big full-blown naval test was at Mylae, 260 BC. Rome brought something like 103 ships versus Carthage's 130 ships. Carthage lost 44 ships, and Rome captured 30 quinqueremes. Casualties included roughly 7,000 killed and 3,000 captured. The corvus played a key role in grabbing 30 enemy ships when Carthaginian vessels came close enough. So early on, Rome's approach was build fast, train quick, and use innovation like the corvus to compensate for maritime inexperience. Over time, the Romans didn't just stop at a few dozen ships. Their ambition grew. By then, both sides were pushing naval warfare to near-industrial scales. Shipbuilding, logistics, crews, supply, all had to scale massively. The central audacious move, and one that few ancient powers would attempt, was this. Rome didn't just build ships. It recruited, trained, and drilled its own legionnaires, and even poor citizens to row and fight at sea. It didn't depend solely on professional sailors. Over time, Rome's naval manpower was drawn from the general population, or at least from less maritime skilled folk. That was risky. Rowing a quinquereme demanded coordination, endurance, precise rhythm, and teamwork under pressure. Also, disease, maintenance, provisioning, all that had to scale. But Rome dug in. In the period around Ecmus, 138,000 men, just the Roman warships. In many ways, Rome reimagined its identity. The soldier wasn't just bound to land, he became sea-capable. That blurred the line between army and navy. The result was Rome became less beholden to maritime tradition experts. The people became the navy. By 243 BC, Rome's navy had been hammered by storms and humiliations. They'd lost ships and disasters at Drana and Phintius, and Carthage still ruled the sea. But Rome wasn't finished. The Senate made a radical call: build a new fleet, financed not by the state treasury, but by wealthy citizens who fronted the money with the promise of repayment from Carthaginian war reparations later. In other words, this was a national Kickstarter campaign, ancient style. Within months, Rome put together roughly 200 new quinqueremes. They took inspiration from a captured Carthaginian speedster known as Hannibal the Rhodian, a vessel famous for its speed and maneuverability around the blockade at Lilybaeum. Roman shipwrights copied its design, shaved off excess weight, and ditched the heavy corvus boarding bridges that had made their earlier ships so clumsy in rough seas. By losing the corvus, the new ships were lighter and could turn faster, making them far more dangerous in a straight naval fight. For context, this new quinquereme was a beast of a warship, about 45 meters long, 5 meters wide, displacing around 100 tons. It carried about 300 rowers and between 40 and 120 marines, depending on the mission. Fully outfitted, each could maintain a speed of 5 to 7 knots. Now, imagine 200 of these monsters being rolled out nearly at once. That's like a small city of carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and timber crews working day and night. One little known detail: before the ships even touched water, Roman crews were drilled on land in mock galleys. They set up wooden frames on the ground that mimicked the benches of a quinquer, then lined men up with practice oarsses so they could learn to row in perfect rhythm. It looked ridiculous, but it meant that when the ships launched, the men weren't flailing around. They already had muscle memory for the cadence. To make it easy to follow, let's split it into 3 acts: the approach, the clash, and the finish. And trust me, the numbers and details make this story even more incredible. Act 1, The Approach. March 10th, 241 BC. At dawn, the Carthaginian commander Hanno was sailing east from the Aegates toward Lilium, what we know today as Marsala in Sicily. His job was clear: break the Roman blockade and get badly needed supplies and reinforcements to Hamilcar's army stuck inland. The west wind that morning seemed like a gift. It filled Carthage's sails and gave them speed towards Sicily. But here's the twist. That same wind also carried their doom. Let's look at what the Romans did differently with their crews. Early in the war, they'd relied on the corvus to let their legionaries board Carthaginian ships because they weren't skilled sailors. By this final phase, they'd scrapped the corvus, but kept the spirit of infantry combat alive. They packed their queen kerms with trained marines, drilled to fight as if each ship were a fortress wall. Catulus, the Roman commander, made the gutsy call to cut his own blockade and sail straight into the teeth of the wind. To neutralize it, the Romans did something crazy. They removed their masts, sails, and any excess gear before battle. Why? Because without sails catching the headwind, their ships were lighter and totally under the control of trained oarsmen. They didn't drift. They powered forward like muscle-driven machines. Now, compare that to Carthage. Hanno had assembled maybe 250 warships, along with somewhere between 150 and 350 transports, loaded heavy with of grain weapons and reinforcements bound for the garrison at Lilybaeum. Archaeologists have pulled some of those ariae from the seafloor off the Aegates, proving how much cargo those ships were hauling. On top of that, Carthage was short of tens of thousands of trained oarsmen after 23 years of war. Some historians estimate they were up to 100,000 rowers short, so they filled their benches with rushed recruits and unskilled men. Heavy ships plus rookie crews seems not a recipe for victory. Archaeologists have actually found the remains of this contrast under the sea. Off the Aegates Islands, divers have recovered dozens of bronze rams, the sharp beaks from quincurims used for ramming. Alongside them, they found Montefortino helmets and whole amphi, exactly the kind of cargo you'd expect on Carthaginian transports. The seafloor still tells the story. Heavy transports packed with supplies collided with stripped-down Roman warships built for one purpose: speed and shock. That contrast is crystal clear if you picture it. Rome's ships stripped light, drilled hard, rowing against the wind in tight formation. Carthage's ships weighed down, harder to steer, crewed by green rowers. The wind looked like an ally for Carthage, but by the time the fleets closed, it became a trap. As Polybius hinted, when the wind blew the wrong way, Carthage's ships turned into targets for practice. Imagine a dynamic map here. Arrows from the west showing Carthage's path toward Lilybaeum. Icons of heavy ships stacked with amphi. From Sicily, Roman arrows cut out to sea, intercepting across the wind. That's the opening picture. Act 2, The Clash. When the lines closed, Rome went in with discipline. Catulus lined his ships up like a wall across the Carthaginian route. Even with the wind in their face, the oars drove those quincurimes forward. Without the drag of sails and masts, the Romans could turn, accelerate, and pivot more easily than their opponents. Carthage did drop its sails to prepare for maneuvering. But the problem was weight. Those ships packed with supplies simply couldn't swing their hulls fast enough, and the inexperienced rowers couldn't keep rhythm under pressure. So, when Roman rams came in low at the waterline, Carthaginian captains often couldn't dodge. Some were struck square, their timbers splintered, water rushing in. Others got locked side by side as Romans jammed their ships into position. That's when the mobile fortress plan showed itself. Each Roman quinquereme carried 40 to 120 marines, battle-tested infantry who fought like legionaries. With shields raised and short swords ready, they stormed over the sides of Carthaginian decks once the ships were locked together. This was no sailor's duel. This was infantry combat transplanted onto the sea. Archaeologists have even recovered Montefortino helmets. from the seabed here. The classic kit of Roman soldiers, proving that these weren't just mariners, but trained troops who fought on deck. The numbers tell the story better than any epic. Carthage lost around 120 ships total, about 50 sunk outright, and 70 captured intact. Roughly 10,000 men were taken prisoner. Rome lost about 30 ships sunk, with maybe 50 more damaged, but still afloat. Think about that swing. One side losing half its fleet in a single morning, the other losing less than a fifth. This wasn't a drawn-out slugfest. It was a lopsided hammer blow. There's even a quirky archaeological footnote. Some bronze rams pulled up from the seabed have designs that don't perfectly match Roman or Carthaginian standards. Scholars think they may have come from ships captured earlier in the war and reused by the opposite side. That means at least a few of the vessels sunk in this final battle were exhibits that had changed hands before, a sign of how long and grueling the conflict had been. Act 3, the finish. Once the front of the Carthaginian line shattered, panic rippled through the rest. Heavier transports couldn't turn in time, and with the west wind pressing them toward Roman rams, they were sitting ducks. Ships in the rear tried to tack away, but with green crews and overloaded hulls, they couldn't keep order. Some capsized in the churn. Others struck rocks, trying to flee toward the so-called sacred ice isle. A few warships managed to escape, but the supply convoy was ruined. By late morning, the results were brutal and final. Half of Carthage's fleet was either on the bottom or in Roman hands. Rome had lost just 30 ships sunk. To visualize the scale, put it in bar chart terms. Carthage, 120 ships gone. Rome, 30 ships gone. A 4.1 kill ratio. In an age when building even one quinquerem required months of timber cutting and hundreds of men, the consequences were immediate. Lilybaum and Hamilla's troops were cut off from supplies. Carthage no longer had the manpower or money to build another fleet. The city sued for peace within weeks. The First Punic War, which had dragged on for 23 years, was finally over. And for the first time, Rome wasn't just a land power. They had become a naval power, a Mediterranean empire in the making. Some sources even note that Hanno, the commander, was executed in disgrace when he returned home, crucified according to tradition. That's how catastrophic this defeat was for Carthage. Archaeology still drives it home today. Bronze rams, helmets, amph, lying in the sea where the greatest naval power of its age collapsed. And that sets up your emotional climax. In a single morning, the greatest naval empire of the ancient world was shattered by people who not long before didn't even know how to build ships. Rome had learned, adapted, and gambled, and the gamble paid off. Rome's audacity to train its soldiers to row and fight at sea, breaking the distinction between land war and sea war, turned into a double-edged sword for Carthage. On the one hand, Rome's risk-heavy approach worked. They scaled fast, absorbed losses, adapted tactics, innovated corvus, and forced Carthage into attritional large-scale warfare on Rome's terms. Rome's citizen base gave it manpower depth. It could field more ships and crews over time. On the other hand, Carthage's reliance on traditional maritime strength meant that as the war dragged on, their advantages eroded, crews were lost, replacements thin, shipyards were taxed, logistics stretched, morale sagged. The very sea which had been Carthage's fortress became a trap. Rome's leap, training its soldiers to row, became the lever that broke Carthage's grip on the Mediterranean. The Carthaginian Senate wasted little time. They could not rebuild a fleet fast enough to save Sicily. Outfitting 200 Queen Cariaimes was something you measured in months of lumber cutting and manpower, not weeks. The garrisons at Lilybaeum and other towns were already starving, so Carthage did what proud powers hate to do. They sued for peace. The treaty they signed is known as the Treaty of Lutatius. The terms were harsh. Carthage ceded all claims to Sicily and the surrounding islands, handed over every Roman prisoner without ransom, and promised to pay 3,200 talents of silver, with 1,000 upfront and the rest spread over 10 years. To put that in perspective, a single talent was about 26 kilos of silver. The 200 talents is roughly 83,000 kilo, or about 183,000 lb of silver. Imagine a fleet of ox carts rolling coin after coin into Roman treasuries for a decade. That's how you picture it. But the damage wasn't just financial. Symbolism mattered. In Rome, the victorious consul Cullus dedicated a temple to Jutna on the campus marches. It was a public "we did it" marker carved into stone. In Carthage, the mood was darker. Ancient accounts say Hanno, the admiral who commanded at the Aegates, was crucified on his return. Whether every detail is reliable or not, the story reflects the sense of humiliation. The great seafaring city had been beaten at sea by an enemy that just 2 decades earlier didn't even know how to build warships. The punishment didn't end there. When Carthage tried to pay its mercenaries after the war, it failed. Years of fighting had left the treasury drained. The mercenaries revolted. This became the Truceless War, or Mercenary War, fought from 241 to 237 BC. Rebel armies grew as unpaid troops, and subject towns joined in. At one point, tens of thousands of fighters were arrayed against Carthage. The city barely survived, and only through brutal, drawn-out battles. The irony, Rome, the very enemy that had just crushed Carthage, behaved almost gentlemanly here, releasing Carthaginian prisoners without ransom, and even letting Syracuse send grain to Carthage. Rome wanted to look like the clean victor, while its rival bled. But the real knife twist came when Carthage tried to recover Sardinia from rebels. Rome stepped in, accused them of violating the treaty, and forced a new deal. Carthage surrendered both Sardinia and Corsica, and added another 200 talents of silver to the bill. Even the historian Polybius, usually careful in judgment, called this move contrary to all justice. Numbers don't lie. Add the totals. For a state already short on cash, that was backbreaking. It's easiest to see the humiliation when you compare the before picture to the after. Before the Aegots, Carthage was the maritime brand of the Western Mediterranean. Its shipyards buzzed, its harbors handled trade that stretched from North Africa to Iberia. It held strategic stepping stones in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Its fleet was the default ruler of the waves. Rome was still a land power, brilliant with legions, yes, but untested on the seas. After the Aegates, Carthage lost Sicily in 241 BC, then Sardinia and Corsica by 237 BC. It paid 4,400 talents of silver in total reparations. It went through a devastating civil war against its own mercenaries. Its fleet, once feared, was a shadow. Meanwhile, Rome turned Sicily into its first overseas province, Provincia Sicilia. That province gave Rome a stable supply of grain, something that fueled armies for generations. Rome also learned a critical lesson. Fleets could be mass-produced with private money. Instead of seeing ships as one-time improvisations, Rome started treating them like permanent infrastructure. This is where the real meaning sets in. By 240, Carthage is still alive but limping. By 230, Rome is already flexing across the Western Mediterranean. The door to Roman hegemony had swung wide open. The defeat at Aegates forced Carthage to change strategy entirely. If the seas were closed, they had to look inland. That's why Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, marched into Iberia in the 230s BC. There he built a new power base, extracting silver from Spanish mines and drilling a new army that would later march with Hannibal across the Alps. In a sense, the Second Punic War was seated by the First's ending. Carthage lost its old foundation and gambled on a new one. Rome, on the other hand, discovered something bigger than Sicily. They discovered the blueprint of empire. Managing an overseas province required governors, taxes, and standing fleets. It turned Rome from a city-state with allies into a state that thought like an empire. Every province after Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, Africa, Asia Minor followed the same playbook, and it started here, after Aegates. And that's where we'll close the book on the Battle of the Aegates. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment below, and tell me, was Rome truly bold or just plain lucky that day? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next episode as we dive into more dramatic naval clashes. Trust me, you won't want to miss how the tables turn next time. Thanks for staying with me until the very end, and I'll see you tomorrow.